Remember, what's been happening in the last few hours is that the Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia is starting a military operation in the Donbas region. And with this, immediately after that, there have been reports of the Russian armor rolling into the Donetsk region. There have been reports of missile strikes that have taken place not just in the Donbas region, but indeed from different parts of Ukraine. What you're looking at are visuals from Ivano-Frankivsk. One of the areas in Ukraine. Besides this, there have also been reports of missile strikes that have taken place in cities such as Kiev and in Kharkiv. And Ukraine at this point of time has announced the closure of its airspace. So what we've been discussing and talking about, debating for the last several weeks about the Russian troop build-up that had taken place along the borders with Ukraine. And this is the moment of truth as the world wakes up to the reality of a Russian incursion that is now staring us in our face, where the Russian armor has rolled into Donbas and there have been reports of missile strikes. Although the details that are emerging from Ukraine at this point of time are still very sketchy, the West, it appears at this point of time, has been found lacking in its diplomatic efforts. The West wanted to somehow deter Russia from carrying out an incursion into Ukraine through financial sanctions, but that seems to have had very little impact with how Russia has, of course, responded since early this morning. Now, to give us more insights in terms of what's, of course, playing out in this crisis, we are joined in by our correspondent Trent, who is joining us live from Berlin. Good morning to you, Trent. This, of course, has been the moment of reckoning for the United States and its allies for several weeks and indeed months now. It had been trying to project a united front to try and deter Russia. But clearly, with the events that have unfolded since early this morning, it appears that the Russians have not been deterred from carrying out an incursion into Ukraine.
Yeah, good morning. Europe is this morning waking up to the news it was so desperate to avoid, and that is, it appears, that Russian President Vladimir Putin is indeed launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Months of diplomacy by European diplomats to try and prevent this moment appear to have failed, sadly. And as we go to air, as you say, there are various reports of missile strikes hitting various locations of Ukraine and Russian army and artillery units moving in. Of course, as you might expect, we are already starting to get some reaction from European leaders. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has released a statement in the last hour. I'm going to read it in full because I think it's important. He says, the Russian attack on Ukraine is a blatant breach of international law. Nothing can justify this, and Germany strongly condemns this act by President Putin. Our solidarity is with Ukraine and its people. He goes on to say that this is a terrible day for Ukraine and a dark day for Europe. Just one of many statements we are hearing this morning. We know the German Chancellor in coming hours will convene a meeting of G7 leaders virtually to discuss this crisis. He will then travel on to Brussels for an in-person meeting with the other leaders of the European Union.
Absolutely, indeed. And also at this point of time, looking at how things have, of course, been unfolding, you know, there were hectic diplomatic parleys that were underway for the last several weeks. The United States and its allies in Europe were talking about creating a deterrence, of imposing financial sanctions on Russia that would have made it impossible for the Russians to carry out an invasion into Ukraine. But that clearly has not happened. You know, especially with respect to Germany, has there been an issue in presenting a united front against the Russians by the Europeans in carrying out this incursion?
Well, I think it's worth noting that it was only last night that the first tranche of sanctions was approved at an EU level. Many describe them as lower level sanctions, I suppose you could say. But the EU is always saying it wanted to keep some cards up its sleeve stronger sanctions, if you will, to introduce in case of this very moment taking place. So I expect what we will see today is the EU, the West, America, talking about beefing up some serious sanctions now, really targeting the big banks of Russia, really targeting President Putin and his inner circle itself, really, I think, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it, given clearly those first round of slightly weaker sanctions haven't prevented this attack from taking place. Of course, in many ways, though, I think we also just have to wait and see what happens over the coming hours. This is a desperate moment for Europe. What happens in the next couple of hours could really determine its trajectory for a very long time. Ursula von der Leyen, speaking of sanctions, has also issued a statement. She has said that in these dark hours, our thoughts are with Ukraine and the innocent women, men and children as they face this unprovoked attack and fear for their lives. Russia will be held responsible. A lot of meetings happening today. We'll have to see how the West responds.
Absolutely, indeed. That, of course, is going to be a crucial question, how the West, of course, responds to this crisis. Now, over the last few weeks, Germany had been reluctant in sending weapons and military hardware for the soldiers in Ukraine to fight with. Will Germany change its stance on the issue of sending in weapons to Ukraine?
Well, Chancellor Scholz has always been keen to point out that a majority of the German people are with him in resisting that question of sending weapons to Ukraine. I mean, polls consistently show about 70% of Germans support that decision to avoid sending weapons to this conflict zone. But of course, now we've seen this full-scale invasion. Will that change? Will there be public conversation about whether that was the right decision? You may have seen last night here in Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate lit up with the colours of the Ukrainian flag. Well, Ukraine's ambassador to Germany was very critical of that move, saying it was just a symbol and doesn't really help much. He called on Germany to send weapons, for more financial aid and for tougher sanctions. I think that middle one, more financial aid, is probably where Germany will go in terms of the first part of this conversation. It likes to remind the world that it is the biggest financial backer of Ukraine when it comes to foreign aid. I would be surprised if we see an immediate backflip here and see Berlin change its decision and to start sending weapons to Ukraine. To be honest, I don't think that will happen. But what I do think is that you will probably see some more pledges of money to the government there to try and help them in their hour of need.
Absolutely indeed, Trent. And just before we let you go very quickly, at this point of time, considering that the incursion into Ukraine has already begun, do you think within the European corridors of power, will there be any appetite at all for sending boots on the ground to create a deterrence for Russia to invade further into Ukraine? Is that a possibility that Europe would even be willing to look at?
Plainly speaking, no, I don't think it is. I think in this sense, Ukraine is probably on its own. It's worth noting US President Joe Biden has consistently said US boots will not go onto the ground in Ukraine. I think Europe will follow America's lead in that. I think they know very plainly that if they do send troops to Ukraine and we have a situation where NATO troops face off against Russian troops on Ukrainian territory, then that potentially is a recipe for a much bigger and a much more dangerous war. And that is something I don't think there is an appetite for here in Europe or in America.
Indeed, thank you very much indeed, Trent Murray, for joining us from Berlin and getting us all those updates. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.